Welcome back to your poppy piece with Maimeri Blue. This is Sarah Simon, the Mint Gardener, and we are going to work on adding some final layers to our watercolor poppies to really take them to that next level. Now, I mentioned in previous tutorials with this piece and with other pieces that I do like to have a scrap piece of paper next to me just to test out what those next layers might be and might look like as I add them. You can absolutely experiment right on your piece. However, I find I'm more willing to take risks if I have a little scrap piece of paper next to me, just keeping track of the colors and what they look like layered and what they look like just on the piece of paper, right? Sometimes what it looks like on the palette is a little bit different than what it looks like on my piece of paper, and even more different once you have multiple layers of watercolor. So I'm using a very small brush. This is a Velvet Touch Round 1. And smaller brushes are going to give you the most amount of control because, as you can see, they suck up a lot less water when you use them in your water jar. But even when you're just using them to pull out that color, it will pick up the color and not as much water just because they don't have as many bristles. I have my paper towel handy, soaking up any excess water, and I'm slowly but surely adding in these interesting leading lines. Again, this is sped up, so if you're painting along with me, feel free to pause, paint in a petal, put on a podcast, then restart it when you're ready for the next petal to see what the direction is. Also study those first pictures to see where I'm adding these leading lines. However, I will say one of my top tips for where do I add leading lines? How do I know what direction? If you think about a flower as a pie, all right, a big round pie, and the very center where you sink your knife into in order to slice it up and give people their slice of pie, that's the center of the flower. So if you're thinking about pie slices and how they're always triangles, those lines coming out of the center of your pie radiate from the center as your focal point, right? And then they come out and they slowly increase in width as they go out, right? They're wider on the outside than they are on the inside. On the inside, they're just a point, and on the outside, it's the outside of a triangle. That is exactly, if you're thinking about how do I do these leading lines, look at each petal as an individual slice of pie. Okay, all of my painting analogies are food related, which I find very funny, but they are very relatable because we all eat, okay? So these different petals, especially on a poppy, they dance in the wind. There's 4 or 5 on each huge poppy stalk. Those centers are quintessential poppy. And if you can capture a little bit of the movement and that poppy center, that pod that carries all of its seeds, right there, your eye will already accept, oh, this is a poppy, okay? You don't need to be perfect with your leading lines. However, as long as they're facing kind of in the right direction and they're all pointing in towards the center, you should be fine. Now, where it gets a little tricky is when the petals are flipped up or overlapping. And so you got to kind of put your thinking cap on and imagine where the petal would actually connect to that center pod that we're painting in, just the lightest green. That light green color is such a fabulous color to have in your painting collection. It's a combination of the Hooker's green in this set with the Naples yellow. Oftentimes we think, oh, to make my secondary color, I have to combine 2 primaries, right? You have to combine your yellow and your blue to get green. However, with this set, I wanted to give you even more variation. So I added in an extra green, and Hooker's green is just a fantastic color. It does have a bit of opacity to it, so it already adds that dimension to it, which is nice. But by having multiple ways to make green, you have more variety. And when you're painting landscapes or botanicals, the more greens you can mix, the better. All right. So I am now going in with just straight Payne's gray and I'm adding in those wobbly topsy-turvy center stamens that are also quintessential to a poppy, all right? Many times, if you're just glancing at a poppy, you don't maybe notice the actual stamen that's connected to the tiny little tip of the stamens. So you could just paint in little dots, but by alternating your line width, you're able to create interest and texture in your piece. Again, everything that we can do to help make our watercolors not feel flat. We've explored adding those different layers of saturation, increasing the color, also changing the variation of maybe we want a little bit more red in this petal, maybe we want a little bit more yellow in this petal. That also helps not make it flat. But by adding variation in our line width, in our leading lines, that's helpful, as well as coming back in with tiny little details like the stamens. All of it, what you're doing is increasing the contrast and the interest, and you're drawing the eye in. Right now, I'm using my very small brush, and that consistency on my palette is about 90% paint, 10% water. We just need enough water to make the paint move, but we don't need anything else. We want very small marks. So I'm creating these leading lines of the petal that's flipped up, but I'm also used a very thin line to just line the very outside of the petal. There's a little glitch there as it slowed down as I was looking at that detail. Move slowly, intentionally. You don't need to add dark, deep lines to every petal, but I would encourage you as you paint one petal in to step back. We can get micro-focused on a project that we're working on, and the more we fall in love with it, the less likely we are to make changes and take chances. But pieces often look the most beautiful when we have played and taken chances. So don't get too attached. If you're feeling frustrated, step away, put it somewhere you can't see it for 24 hours. Then when you come back 24 hours later, flip it over. And I promise you, it's going to be much more beautiful than how you may have remembered it. That's always a nice little trick I give myself. I'm also creating midtones in greens. Notice I wanted to add a little bit of shadow beneath the face of that poppy pod. And then I want to add little shadow details in between where the stamen is, where all the stamens are. By doing that, I just added a little bit more green. Still that combination of the Naples yellow and the Hooker's green. I just increased the amount of Hooker's green on my palette mixture. You can see a lot of the colors on this palette are actually dried from our previous mixing time. That helps you tremendously when you're trying to come back and make really fine small lines. Oftentimes I can mix the most perfect color, but then I can't get that color onto my paper because it is so full of water from mixing it in the first place. So my suggestion is let your palette dry with that color then crystallized on your palette. And it serves as, like I like to say, like a little bookmark. So you can come back, see how you can take off that excess water, and you can come back and add these fine small details, smoothing in any hard drying lines, but also being able to access really interesting mixed colors that happen naturally on your palette with these incredible colors from Maimeri Blue. I hope you enjoyed. I really cannot wait to see your poppies, what color combinations you choose, and I hope you enjoyed this beautiful set.